Let's talk about the fact of no free will and the importance of personal responsibility. Now, that just sounds like a flat out contradiction. By the way, I'm Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis channel. So, a couple of things I've learned over the years is that A, there is no such thing as free will. I'm sorry. You can bang your head against the wall, you can protest, you can scream and shout, but free will is one of those ideas that is as close to being completely debunked as any idea has ever been scientifically. There's just no basis for it. But on the other hand, having seen clients professionally for 28 years, people who depress, who anxietize, who have phobias and compulsions, if there's one thing that a good psychotherapist often does, it's to help the client to increase his or her own sense of choice and agency and their practice of self responsibility. Let's take a look at, for example, the notion of depression. If you speak to people who claim to be depressed, you will very often or almost always notice that one of the hallmarks is a sense of despair, a deep, profound sense of hopelessness and helplessness. They very often perceive that they have no choice, they really have no agency, and things seem completely hopeless. If you look at what people call trauma, and if you really drill down on it, you'll see that most of these people will report a sense of inescapability, of being stuck. If you speak to people who have attempted suicide or people who are contemplating suicide, you will so often see someone who says that they feel trapped. They feel a sense of being a burden to other people and that they feel socially disconnected at the same time, and they have a sense of hopelessness about it and helplessness. They very often feel that ending their life is the only way to escape the torture chamber of your own of their own mind, right? So much of what those of us who do coaching, therapy, or change work do is to help people to get strong at what Viktor Frankl famously expressed. He used to say that between stimuli and response, there's a space. And in that space lies man's freedom to choose his own response, to become aware of that, to cultivate that, and to develop flexibility around that. If you look at cognitive behavioral therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy or pretty much any school of psychotherapy that actually works, that's actually useful, you will see that one of the main tenets is to help people to discover that no, their feelings are not triggered by the environment. They're not just passively reacting to events and circumstances or people, but that they themselves are actually meaning makers and storytellers, and that it's how they think and how they interpret and how they make meaning, which is really where the game is at, where people begin to realize that they're largely feeling their own thinking. And with that discovery, people discover that they can change how they interpret, they can change how they make meaning, they can have more cognitive flexibility, and or they can kind of see that what they're experiencing is a thought construct to begin with. When people have profound changes in psychotherapy and coaching, they have very often had some insight and some development of skill in this direction. So they're no longer having that sense of being trapped or inescapability or that sense of hopelessness. They have the sense of agency that they can think or behave or do something different and therefore have a different life and or a different experience of life. Not only in what we call psychotherapy, but in a civilized society, for you to have freedom, or for those who favor democracy, how could you have a democracy unless you have people who can, in a kind of independent way, step back and and have choice? And one of the things that has made Scandinavia so great, and we've lost this, by the way, but we used to have a culture of trust. What really made Scandinavia great was that deep culture of trust. But you can't have a culture of trust if people don't have a sense of personal responsibility, if people aren't willing to carry their own weight and to be accountable. Not only that, but we know that there's nothing more crippling to people than a victim identity, than an identity of victimhood. And sadly, this is being promoted today so strongly through how therapists medicalize everything and sell people the idea that the roughages of life are really brain diseases and chemical imbalances and illnesses that they have no choice about, but that they need dangerous brain drugs or expert counsel to somehow have a better life. But here's the question: how do we reconcile this, or map this onto the notion of there being no free will? How how does that even make sense? A lot of people, might discover no free will through reading scientifically, reading books like Sam Harris's Free Will, or really looking into the neuroscience literature. Um, and discovering the fact of no free will can, for many people, be extremely depressive. Because if they're unhappy with life, it can, depending upon how they interpret it, it can be an extreme burden to then be told that you essentially have no choice. You're just a puppet. It also takes away the whole idea of meritocracy. That you can feel good about yourself, or have pride, or contentment, based upon your accomplishments. Because if there's no free will, you really deserve no credit deeply, for anything that you've done, because you're not the author or the chooser behind it to begin with. You're just damn lucky. So people often have a lot of psychological resistance to kind of embracing this idea. Now, as Sam Harris and some other people like to point out, it can also be deeply liberating to realize no free will, because it's harder to hate, it's harder to be resentful, it's easier to forgive if you truly see that this person could not have done differently. Because to really resent or hate someone over time, you need to kind of project that there's a person in there who chose to do this and could have done differently. And if that's no longer there, then those emotions don't really make sense in the same way. You can also be more self compassionate, especially if your own life hasn't quite gone the way you wanted it to. If you can truly grasp that at no point could you have done anything different, and no one else could have done anything different. It all just emerged the way it did, and any idea that things could or should have been different is also just emerging and a pure fantasy. There can be enormous relief in this. Here's a funny thing, sometimes when you hear meditation masters speak, they might talk about, this is anger, or anger is arising, or angering is here, instead of I'm angry, right? And that's kind of more accurate in a sense, because angering is really just arising. There really is no one who's doing it or being it per se. But I remember quite a few years ago reading Theodore Dalrymple's book, uh, The Knife Went In. He's a prison psychiatrist, retired, the author of many books. And he wrote this book called The Knife Went In, which is a kind of an autobiography of his career as a prison psychiatrist. And it just dawned on him one day that the most common thing that murderers would say when they were asked what happened was that, well, blah, 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 and then the knife went in, right? It was never I stabbed him or I did that. There was never an agent. It was just the knife went in, right? So, in some ways, the way these murderers and prisoners spoke were quite similar to the way that some of these meditation masters spoke, which is kind of quite chilling, you know, if you if you think about it. Here's what I suggest. Here's what's lacking. I think that it's better to be deluded to think that you have choice and free will as long as you haven't seen that there is no such thing as a self. And when I say thing as a self, I'm acknowledging that there's selfing, there's self referential thinking, but there's no entity in here. There's no thinker behind the thoughts. There's no decider behind the decisions. There's no chooser behind the choices. There's no perceiver behind the perceptions or witness behind the witnessing. It's just activities occurring. So once someone sees that there is no such thing as a self, just like the Buddha said, in the cognizing, there's just the cognizing. In the seeing, there's just the seeing. In the hearing, there's just the hearing. In the feeling, there's just the feeling. There's no feeler, thinker, doer behind it. Once it's seen that there is no thinker behind the thoughts, then it's also seen that there's no one to have free will, right? There is no thinker, there is no doer, right? So the problem with the statement, there is no free will, is that it kind of makes it seem as if, look, there used to be this self that you thought had free will, but not it's been, you know, revealed that you or the self don't have free will. A more accurate way to look at this is to say that, look, there really is no self to have it. There's no one to have it. There is will, there is agency, there is choice in a sense, but there's no one doing it. So if you truly watch your own experience, you'll notice that thoughts appear, perceptions appear, sensations appear, and then from time to time, these I thoughts appear that claim credit and say, I did that, I saw that, I decided that. But if you watch carefully, you'll notice that these are always ad hoc entities, seemingly. They always arise after the fact. This I thought that emerges and might say, this Rasmussen guy's nuts. Of course I have free will. That thought, which often seems like you or what you are, also just arises. Here's another thing to kind of meditate on, and that is that yes, there are intentions. There is deliberate behavior or thinking or intending, but intentions also just emerge. That's the big trick, right? Because if people still believe that they are essentially the thinker of thoughts, but who now has no agency, that's the worst position to kind of be in. So I think I never tend to stress the idea of no free will with clients, but if people bring it up or if they are on the meditative path, it's extremely important to do some direct inquiry and to see if this self that they think themselves to be is actually there in experience. To the extent that you can do that, there's no longer a contradiction between the notion of personal responsibility and there being no such thing as free will. And this is how. So, I mean, it still makes sense to talk about the individual. The term the individual still points to something. Just like in the ocean, it still makes sense to talk about the individual waves. They are distinct expressions of the ocean. They're all ocean, meaning that there really is no thing as a self separate from nature emerging. You know, what we call the sense of self or the mind emerges as part of the same process as the sky and the rain and the moon and the clouds, you know, as everything, you know, emerges. So it all emerges as part of one process. Now, personal, once it's seen that there really is no such thing as a self, victimhood makes no sense. Because no one else has any free will either. There's no one out there who has agency, and there is no I separate from everything else. There's just life occurring fundamentally. So that completely blows out that sense of victimhood because there's no victim, right? Simultaneously, we need a sense of individuality and we need a kind of sense of self to coordinate tasks and to cooperate. And, you know, if you and I have an agreement, you know, I'm supposed to show up and do this and you're supposed to show up and do that, we have to kind of hold each other accountable. So there's really no contradiction there. Now, what you can do is you can acknowledge, you can on the one hand acknowledge if you're dealing with your kids or your spouse or some other person that there really is no self in there that's doing these things, right? That's a hallucination of the mind. So the person could not have done anything different, right? We can acknowledge that, but we can still hold the person accountable and tell the person, you know, what we expect of him or her, or offer suggestions, or give the person input that implies that he or she is responsible. Because A, we couldn't have done otherwise, obviously, and B, that information becomes part of the web that the next choices emerge out of, right? So the fact that we hold each other responsible, that information is part of the web of information that the very next action emerges out of. So we can still hold each other responsible socially. We can still uphold contracts. Victimhood still makes no sense. We can still punish criminals or lock them up. We can, on the one hand, deeply see that things could not have been any different. Any idea that it could have been any different is an imagination. But we can still offer suggestions for improvement, for better boundaries, express our expectations, and again, this is part of the web. Also, socially, it makes a lot of sense to be able to say that, you know, these are my feelings, these are my opinions, this is what I want, this is my decision. To be able to make a distinction between your inner life as an individual and someone else's inner life as an individual, even though we're both part of the same interdependent soup, right? Or just life emerging. We kind of need to be able to do that. But we can simultaneously have the insight that there is angering occurring or some thought occurring, that there really is There's no I who's doing the anger or responsible for the angering. And in that sense, you get the best of both worlds. I hope this was useful. If you're on the meditation path and you're stuck in these sorts of shifts, or if there's any change you want to make in your life and you're curious to see if you and I could be a good fit, know that I see clients from all over the world online. I invite you to contact me, send me an email. We can set up a conversation and see if it makes sense to work together. I also do mentoring with both meditators, psychologists, psychotherapists, NLP folks, hypnotherapists. If you're looking for some good mentoring, you can have a look at that at provocativehypnosis.com too, and also send me an email. And if you're watching this in 2025, in June, I'm doing a 4-part series on how to integrate meditation practices in psychotherapy and coaching, and also how to troubleshoot the kind of traps that people might fall into on the meditative path. So if this might be of interest to you, check out the seminar page at provocativehypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening. Hope you got something from it.